In the olden times, technology constantly blew people's mind, like fire make warm and cook meat? Now, computer pretty much alive and soon cook me. But not this me. Microsoft continues to herald its AI future by secretly putting an AI-assisted super resolution feature in Windows 11. The tool was first discovered on Twitter by user @PhantomOfEarth, who posted screenshots from the 26052 preview build of Windows. Of course, since this was a hidden feature added by Microsoft, not just anyone could find it. You need to use an external tool to enable it.
ChatGPT.
The feature can be used to make supported games play more smoothly with enhanced details, but seems to also work with native Windows apps and even windowed games, meaning it could potentially support older titles. According to Tom's Hardware, your system needs a GPU with tensor cores or a processor with an NPU, but that's all part of Microsoft's AI future. Starting this summer, AI processors will become standard for Windows PCs as part of the major OS overhaul everyone thought would be Windows 12, but is allegedly just an update to Windows 11 called 24H2, starring Kiefer Sutherland. The International Data Corporation forecasts 60% of PC shipments will be AI PCs within the next 3 years. The hell is that? So it sounds like Microsoft will get their dream of a future full of hundreds of AI products, all named Copilot.
We are all Copilot.
There's only one pilot, but there are many Copilots. AMD was secretly funding a project to make CUDA compatible with Radeon cards for 2 years. Now that project is open source. Developer Andrei Yannick originally created Zluda to enable CUDA support on Intel hardware, but Team Red reached out to him after he abandoned it to see if he could adapt it to work on their graphics software stack. Now, apparently Radeon cards can run unmodified CUDA code, i.e. CUDA-enabled software can run on AMD GPUs without any input from the software's developers. Not only does Zluda, I love it, work on both Windows and GNU/Linux, but as mentioned up top, it's now fully open source. AMD decided to stop funding Yannick's development, and due to a clause in his contract, that meant he could FOSS the hell out of it. While the software shows promise, there are some caveats. We can't have anything nice. For example, code for NVIDIA Optics, also known as Team Green's ray tracing API, does not work, but it does allow Radeon GPUs to run native CUDA code in Blender 4.0 faster than AMD's own Radeon HIP code. Some people say AHIP, I say HIP, leading to quicker rendering. Yannick hasn't necessarily re-abandoned the project, but says without financial backing, he will only work on improvements he is personally invested in. He's fully self-actualized. Fortunately, that includes getting DLSS working on Radeon GPUs. Zluda's code is all on GitHub, so if you want to contribute, get forking started. If you get that joke, I'm so proud of you.
Young Zluda is my rap name.
Zluda! Yeah! Apple has apparently decided to settle the lawsuit it brought against chip startup Rivos 2 years ago. The Cupertino crew, who wrote this, initially alleged that Rivos led a coordinated campaign to recruit Apple's chip designers and instructed the poached employees to steal trade secrets on their way out the door, though the trade secrets claim was actually dismissed a year later. According to filings, the settlement will allow Apple to conduct a forensic examination of Rivos systems to recover any confidential information. Speaking of in-depth analysis, iFixit has published part 2 of their Vision Pro teardown, where they discuss the actual display resolution of the device. Turns out, the horizontal resolution falls a bit short of the 4K standard, explaining why Apple didn't refer to their panels as 4K. Plus, the average pixels per degree is 34, like me. While that's great in terms of modern headsets, it's almost 1/3 the PPD of an iPhone 15 Pro Max held 1 foot away from your face.
Which is superior.
Like me. This may help explain why Mark Gurman thinks it could kill the iPad as Apple's Mac replacement in several years. According to some of the device's designers, it'll take 4 generations for the device to reach its ideal form. I'm guessing that's the one where it's actually worth what they're charging for it.
It actually evolves into a giant space baby.
It's full of stars. Now it's time for the quick bits, brought to you by Delete Me, the pros at keeping your personal stuff, well, personal? Ever Googled yourself and found tons of your info floating around? Not cool, very creepy, right? It can lead to annoying calls, dodgy emails, and even identity theft. But fear not, Delete Me's got your back. Their tech whizzes and expert team will boot your info off those sketchy people's search sites. No need for you to waste hours sorting it out. Delete Me's got it covered. And the best part, they send you personalized privacy reports showing what they found, where they found it, and what they nixed. Ready to kick your personal info out of the web spotlight? Head to joindeleteme.com/techlinked and use code TechLinked for a sweet 20% off. It's a sweet 20%.
No, that is-
You know, there's a cool million and a sweet 20.
Absolutely.
You know that. When it comes to brightening my day, I always think of one thing: the sun. If I were to think of two things, the second thing would be quick bits. According to reports, Xbox head Phil Spencer, it's the whole head, had an internal town hall last week where he told employees they would keep making consoles. And that's great news, because it means the new reports that Microsoft Surface team is going to be developing the next Xbox devices could be legitimate. Specifically, Xbox Insider Mag claims there will be 2 next-gen Xbox devices, but only one will be a traditional console. The other will be a dockable handheld that can both stream games from the cloud and run games locally. Pretty soon, you'll be able to verbally berate 8-year-olds from the comfort of a coffee shop, where they're not allowed. NVIDIA has launched a new workstation GPU with the unusual name RTX 2008 generation. Not to be confused with the RTX 20 series of gaming GPUs, nor the RTX A2000, which this card is replacing. Is that clear? NVIDIA's confusing decisions continue in the specs. The new card's interface is limited to PCIe 4.0 X8 instead of X16. And while memory has been bumped to 16 gigabytes, its interface was downgraded from 192 to just 128-bit bus for a 22% lower memory bandwidth overall. But at $625, the RTX 2008 generation is also 22% more expensive than the RTX A2000 when it was launched. So the math is perfectly in line with what we've come to expect here.
Makes sense.
10 days ago, Google announced that YouTube had hit over 100 million premium subscribers, and now Google One has reached the same milestone, possibly indicating that the Venn diagram of Google users willing to pay for an additional cloud storage and to get rid of ads is just a circle. 100 million might sound like a lot, but it's nothing compared to Apple's billion-plus paid subscribers for Apple Music, Apple One, and iCloud Plus. Honestly, it's kind of weird knowing that YouTube Premium has fewer subscribers than MrBeast. Engineers at MIT have created a stamp-sized sticker that monitors the health of a patient's internal organs using ultrasound, or at least it does in rats. Ultra rats. Just joking. But humans, much like ultra rats, have organs inside their bodies, so it's still pretty exciting. This small wearable ultrasound would allow continuous monitoring, meaning it could catch sudden changes in a transplant patient's condition before it's too late, especially if they are a rodent of some kind.
They are so smart.
Humans?
No, the rats. They figure this out?
And this year's Super Bowl ads were full of AI! Yeah! Several companies decided to shell out for NFL spots to show off their new fancy software. Microsoft talked about Copilot for the 17,000th time. Google showed off an accessibility feature to help the visually impaired take selfies. And Etsy demonstrated how you can buy cheese for the French. They don't need our cheese. Coca-Cola took a slightly different tactic by parodying the infamous AI-generated beer commercial to advertise their new sports drink has no artificial sweeteners, because nothing in sports should be artificial. Everything should be natural, except the amount of head trauma.
Actually, it's probably natural.
It's paranormal, actually. The ghost in the helmet. And it's only paranatural for you to come back on Wednesday for more tech news. It comes in multiple flavors. Just lick your screen and find them all.
No, don't. What?
Do it. Oh boy, there are some stories today. You won't believe these stories. There are stories, and we're gonna tell you about them. And let me just say, when Apple opened pre-orders for the Vision Pro this morning, demand was so high, it seems to have exceeded available supply. Shipping estimates for each of the headset's 3 storage options have now moved from February 2nd to mid-March. But if you're sad, you'll have to wait an extra month for your Face MacBook. Maybe don't be, since the device is shipping without a Netflix app of any kind. Literally unplayable.
What am I supposed to do?
Not chill. We're not just talking about a native Vision OS app, mind you. Back in September, Apple claimed nearly all iPad and iPhone apps can run on Vision OS unmodified. But Netflix has confirmed to Bloomberg that they're not making theirs compatible at all, despite the process sounding much easier than, well, buying a Vision Pro. And Netflix isn't the only app absent from the platform. Bloomberg also was told by YouTube it will not allow its iPad app to work on Vision Pro, while a person familiar with Spotify's plans said their app wouldn't show up either. And according to Mac Stories, many other popular apps have also manually opted out of making their existing apps usable on the platform. But no one is saying why, leaving us to assume the only logical explanation is that they're all making their own $3,500 headsets.
This music looks amazing.
Amazon is planning to launch a paid subscription for its voice assistant later this year, according to leaked internal documents and sources. We leak these sources everywhere. They have a tentative and very original name for the upgraded version of ALEXA. They're calling it ALEXA Plus. Apparently, Miss Plus will have more ChatGPT style features to give it better conversational and reasoning skills so you can get better input on what specific toilet paper you should order with same-day shipping.
ChatGPT doesn't even use toilet paper.
Same-day wiping. Even better than that, the upgraded assistant will allegedly be able to tell the difference between when you are finished speaking and when you're just pausing, so it doesn't cut you off. The Plus model could launch as soon as June 30th, but there are some roadblocks. For starters, while the new assistant is a better conversationalist, it's not very good at assisting. It gives overly long answers, makes factual errors, and frequently hallucinates, like a toddler on acid. On top of those pretty severe issues, there's also reports of internal conflict at Amazon, with some employees feeling they shouldn't charge for the upgrade. It's almost like customers already paying Amazon's multitude of other subscriptions might not want another one.
Okay, guys, this is too many features.
Don't buy it. TSMC says it anticipates further delays in getting their second Arizona fab up and running. Initially projected to be up and running in 2026, Chairman Mark Liu now says it will probably take until 2027 or even 2028, when we won't exist.
My toddler's doing acid by then.
Once again, blaming all those gosh darn skilled workers for apparently not existing, just as he did when the company announced a similar delay for their other Arizona factory. Making things even worse, the chips output by Factory 2 may end up less advanced than planned. TSMC wanted their first factory to produce 4nm chips, while the second factory made chips using 3nm tech. But now the company says that 3nm capability is dependent on funding promised by the US government through their CHIPS Act. However, TSMC hasn't received their promised grant yet. Instead, the Biden administration gave first funding to BAE Systems, a military supplier that makes chips for fighter jets, which are admittedly a lot sexier than computers and phones.
Cool.
However, even if TSMC can make a 3nm fab, this delay could mean the factory is a whole generation of silicon tech behind before it even opens its doors. The Arizona chips are gonna feel so old when they hear Taiwanese chips saying all this new slang they don't understand. They're gonna be like, sweet, dude.
That's not based at all.
Now it's time for Quick Bits, brought to you by Grammarly. Not everyone at Linus Media Group is a writer, but thanks to Grammarly, they don't have to be word nerds to write well. Grammarly's generative AI helps our business team work faster by improving their writing. It can help get you started with ideas, outlines, and even advice. Grammarly's rewrite feature can spice up your sentences, and if your inbox is overwhelmed, their reply feature can summarize emails and suggest responses to lighten your load. And with Grammarly, you're in control of your data. View all of it at any time by requesting a personal data report. Try out Grammarly for free by creating an account at grammarly.com/TL01. And if you want to get access to extra features, get 20% off Grammarly Premium while you're there.
Let's just get these pesky Quick Bits out of my pocket so they're ready to, what? They're gone. What are we gonna do? Our show is dependent on the Quick Bits. How are we gonna finish if there's not? They're in my other pocket. It's all good. Mark Zuckerberg has announced that Meta will be pursuing the creation of an artificial general intelligence, presumably so he can have members of his own kind to talk to on this planet. Part of Zuckerberg's vision is to make Meta's theoretical future AI relatively open source, similar to their Llama LLM, rather than solely controlled by a few elite companies who know jujitsu. This, of course, raised concerns about the general public having access to tools roughly equivalent to human intelligence. Right now, the general public isn't intelligent at all. At press time, Zuckerberg was quoted as saying, "Grow, my children. Move fast and break things." BMW will be introducing general-purpose humanoid robots from Figure at a manufacturing plant in South Carolina. Figure CEO Brad Adcock, whose name is a complete sentence. I'm a professional. It's hard when the whole room is crying. Says that they're planning to ship their first Figure 01 robot within the year. However, these bots will likely start with one task before expanding their repertoire, mostly repetitive, unappealing tasks like stacking pallets or unpacking boxes. So hard to read when there's tears in your eyes. There's plenty of room to expand because these robots can apparently learn complex actions, like how to make a pot of coffee just by imitating videos of humans. Just nobody let it watch Westworld.
That's what you want, okay.
I'm installing Adcock right now. A janitor's house that was being used as office space has been converted into an assistive smart home. The Council of the English City of Sunderland undertook the project to allow occupational therapists and technologists, as well as their customers and partners, to have a space to train with assistive technology and to try out ideas to maximize independence for clients. They even used the space to help make gaming more accessible to kids. After all, being differently abled shouldn't bar you from normal childhood activities like being bullied in Fortnite.
This the council decrees.
Microsoft has made an AI reading tutor available for free. Reading Coach. That's the name. Generates stories for users to read while being equipped with guardrails to keep things appropriate. Users can make choices to alter the story's plot to help make learning more engaging while personalizing the experience by learning what words the learner is commonly mispronouncing. There's even a reward system that unlocks new elements and characters that can be used to generate new stories. And if that sounds too good to be true, that's because you're still gonna need a Microsoft account to access it.
They got your kids. They got them now.
And a handheld AI-powered skin cancer detector has been approved by the FDA in an encouraging example of AI that's being used for something other than pumping the internet full of detritus. The DermaSensor device accurately identified skin cancer 96% of the time and correctly ruled it out 97% of the time in the FDA study, which is great news for the 1 in 5 Americans who will get some type of skin cancer by age 70. But just in case the story made you feel too good, I'm obligated to add that the DermaSensor will be available to doctors through a subscription of $200 a month per 5 patients or $400 a month for unlimited use. But think of the time savings though, you know?
Oh yeah.
And those 3 out of 100 people? Pranks! It was a prank, bro! I'm not sorry about giving you even more tech news if you come back on Monday, but if you don't come back, you just don't get tech news.
Yeah,
Hurtling through the air in a device made of several million parts in a portion of the Earth where the temperature generally sits at minus 40 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit, and there isn't enough oxygen or atmospheric pressure to keep you alive. All the while, a rather complex combination of controlled explosions and rapidly spinning parts is both providing the oxygen you're breathing, initially at 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees Celsius, more on that in the bonus facts section, while it also propels you along at hundreds of miles per hour in order to defeat gravity's deathly pull. In the meantime, some smiling individual serves you a tasty beverage and a little bag of pretzels. As you go through turbulence and see the wings of your plane bending back and forth at upwards of 7 meters of flex at the tips, you may find yourself rethinking your life choices. But while all the factors that go into asserting dominance over gravity and distance may make it seem bonkers that this is a practically feasible mode of transportation, as I think most are aware outside of riding an elevator, which is arguably the safest way to travel, there isn't really much of a safer way out there to get from point A to point B than large commercial aircraft. Not even walking. That said, commercial aviation accidents do happen. So if you ever do find yourself in such, what is the safest seat on the airplane for you to be sitting in order to reduce the odds of being injured or dying? And what other ways can you ensure that you're as least likely as possible to cease to exist on a plane if it ever plummets from the sky while you're sitting in it? Well, put your tray tables and seat backs in the upright position, fasten your safety belt, and let's nosedive into it all, shall we? And further, we'll look at a rather crazy incident in 2012 in Mexico in which the pilots deliberately parachuted out of a Boeing 727, which then plummeted towards the Earth afterwards. How bonkersly safe commercial aviation has become. To begin with, ever since the first ever person killed in a plane crash, we'll get to this person, a passenger aboard a plane flown by one of the Wright brothers in the bonus facts later, people have been freaking out and obsessing over deaths from air travel, despite that, as noted, commercial airline travel is extremely safe. But what perhaps gets lost on people is just how insanely safe it has become in the last 2 decades. For example, in 2022, there were over 70 million commercial passenger transport aviation flights, carrying a total of close to 5 billion passengers. How many of these 5 billion passengers died, do you think? Well, the answer's 174. That's it. Further, if you happen to live in Europe, China, the US, Japan, Canada, Australia, Israel, or New Zealand, the data shows that you're about 30 times less likely to die in a given commercial aviation flight than in more undeveloped regions of the world, and more lax regulations abound. But even in the worst of these regions, they still achieve an astounding safety rating of only about 1 death per 1.2 million passengers. Important to point out is that this latter worst-case data is about a 3-fold improvement over the global average in 1977 of about 1 in 350,000 passengers, which was still pretty crazy safe compared to all other forms of transport. As Arnold Barnett of MIT noted after authoring the study on airline safety in 2020 that we pulled the data from, quote, "The worldwide risk of being killed had been dropping by a factor of 2 every decade. The pace of improvement has not slackened at all, even as flying has got ever safer and further gains have become harder to achieve." As to how these incredible rates have been achieved and continue to improve rapidly, despite already being about as close to zero odds as one can practically get, the various regulatory bodies the world over, such as the FAA in the United States, are downright obsessed with reducing the number of deaths from commercial aviation accidents to 0, despite how completely impossible this would have seemed half a century ago. And in fact, in the US, they actually have achieved this among US-based commercial passenger jet airliners over American soil in recent years, with most sources claiming not one fatality that meets those criteria since 2009. However, that's not fully accurate. There was actually 1 death if you really dig into it. Again, just 1 since 2009, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. This again is all thanks to a level of obsession over safety that is unparalleled in any other form of transportation. If the various regulatory bodies overseeing countless other facets of life took the same attitude and with the same fervor and willingness to throw quite literally any amount of money at the problems, there'd be a lot fewer deaths everywhere. For example, in automobile accidents, injuries and deaths could be reduced by orders of magnitude overnight simply by requiring all car manufacturers to switch up the seating arrangement so that all seats, except for the drivers for practical reasons, face backward, saving upwards of hundreds of thousands of lives per year and reducing injuries to millions more. A tiny change compared to what bodies like the FAA require of airline manufacturers to even just squeeze out a few extra probable saved lives. But seemingly, this will never happen because most people don't like the idea and everybody feels relatively safe driving a car, despite how dangerous it actually is. Of course, in aviation, given the widespread fear of the act of hurtling through the air, most people are quite happy that the regulatory bodies overseeing flight are so incredibly obsessed with safety, no matter the cost or even inconvenience to passengers going through the process of going through the airport to get to the plane, or while happily driving along in our likely speeding automobiles to the airport, rocking out to some great blaring music while texting our friends and eating our McDonald's at the same time, which totally and in no way will contribute to you being one of the 60,000 or so people who die every single day of heart disease. For reference, this would be the equivalent of around 400 commercial aviation passenger jet crashes every single day where everyone on board was killed. Humans. You see, things we should actually be worrying about and having governments of the world quite literally throw all the money at, like heart disease, 20 million deaths per year and rising fast, and cancer, 10 million deaths per year, could surely be reduced. And speaking of things in the sky, it's not just planes. So let's now talk about actual, absolutely fascinating data here. Comparing to other modes of transport, if you happen to ever be in a room with around 100 people in it, you can be reasonably assured that at least one of them in the room is going to die in a car accident. But you'd need to be in a room full of around 250,000 people before it would be likely that one of you would die in a commercial aviation accident. Granted, this isn't an apples-to-apples comparison, as more people drive every day than fly, but even when looking at the mile-for-mile data, large commercial plane aviation dominates, and it is not even close. For example, according to data compiled by Ian Savage at Northwestern University, from 2000 to 2009, cars had a death rate of about 7.28 per billion people per billion miles. Ferries were at 3.17 deaths per billion miles, trains at 0.43, subways at 0.25, buses actually shockingly safe at 0.11, and commercial aviation passengers have the lowest rate of all with 0.07, or a little over 100 times less likely to die mile for mile than those in a car. And then there's motorcycles. Going back to the car data at 7.28 deaths per billion miles as the worst mentioned so far, well, motorcyclists were at 212.57, or 3,000 times more likely to die riding a motorcycle each mile than in a passenger plane mile for mile. To put it yet another way, talking just crashes, not deaths, and in more realistic timelines for a typical person, for every 1 million miles you travel, a ballpark amount commonly driven by a person in their lifetime in America, in your car, you can expect to be involved in 4.5 crashes. How many drives this is will vary considerably, and no one really has the data that we could find. But in order to have a likelihood of being involved in the same number of crashes in commercial aviation in the United States, you would need to take 500,000 flights. To attempt to make this slightly more apples to apples on this one, if you drive roughly 15,000 miles per year in the US starting at the age of 16, you'll make it to the age of 83 before you cross 1 million miles driven and those probable 4.5 accidents. To reach that same number of accidents aboard a commercial plane, you'd need to take one flight every single day for 1,174 years. Now you might be thinking to yourself, but most car accidents don't result in deaths. But don't most people die in plane accidents? And the answer is no, not even close. In fact, most people involved in a typical commercial aviation accident not only survive, but are generally uninjured, with the US National Transportation Safety Board noting that from 2001 to 2017 on this one, 98.2% of people survived commercial aviation accidents during that span with minor or no injuries, 0.6% were seriously injured and survived, and 1.3% died. Over in Europe, the European Transport Safety Council puts it at about 90% survivability there. The slight discrepancy here may be in that short-hop, slightly smaller commercial planes under 60 passengers tend to have worse safety records than their larger counterparts, though it's still insanely good, and Europe as a whole has a lot more of these type of relatively short-hop flights than the United States, where there is a whole lot of nothing and vast distances between many cities. Or it could be that the obscene safety ratings we have in Europe and the US in the last couple of decades are so good that even just a few particularly brutal accidents can skew the numbers markedly despite the countless millions of flights in that span. As to this minuscule number of accidents and comparing it to cars, from 2015 to 2020, in the US, there were 62 million car accidents, resulting in just shy of 15 million injuries. In that exact same span in commercial aviation, there were only 176 accidents in the US, resulting in a mere 111 injuries. As noted, the US is also currently maintaining a rather extreme streak since 2009 of only one single death aboard a US-operated commercial passenger jet in the United States. Again, we'll get into that bizarre story in just a little bit. For further illustration, according to the International Air Transport Association, based on 2022 flight fatality data they collected, you could take a flight every day for a whopping 25,214 years before you'd be 100% likely to die in a commercial passenger plane crash sometime in that span. And they further note that 2022 wasn't even a good year here, as the data was skewed all by just one accident in China that killed 132 of the 158 people killed that year in such accidents in their dataset, which comprised about half the flights in the world that year. How not to die in an aviation accident. Safest seat on the plane. Of course, obscenely unlikely is one thing, but as noted in the data there, if you fly every day for about 260 years, you're statistically likely to get into one accident. And you don't want to end up being one of the 0.6% of people in those accidents seriously injured, or one of the 1.3% in such accidents who no longer ever get to worry about anything else ever again, do you? So what seat should you sit in to be the safest, and what other ways can you ensure the way you die is not in an instant and then eternal peace, and instead a steady slow decline as age, disease, and watching your friends and loved ones pass over many years gradually strips you of your humanity, and you will live until you beg for something like a catastrophic airliner accident to occur so that you can finally have the inevitable, sweet, merciful release of eternal sleep.
The fuck?
For starters, let's look at the safest seat on commercial airplanes, as if it actually matters. I mean, nothing matters, we're all just going to die anyway, but let's look at the data on the safest seat anyway to help distract us from our pointless human lives, which is, of course, one of the purposes of this channel for both you and our basement-dwelling authors. First, before jumping into the wider statistics, we want to talk about a crazy experiment where a group of scientists intentionally crashed a Boeing 727 full of crash test dummies, cameras, and sensors in order to study a real-world scenario, rather than it being computer simulated as is typical. Initially attempting to perform the experiment in the US, the FAA noped out of that one owing to the risk of the now unpiloted jet accidentally going along its merry way and killing someone on the ground or otherwise doing damage, something the FAA is firmly against. Apparently, Trevor Jacob didn't get this memo. The Mexican authorities instead were like, don't mind if I do. They decided to allow it near the city of Mexicali on April the 27th of 2012. They did, however, require that real pilots be on board instead of having the whole thing be automated and remote controlled as was the initial plan. As the pilots apparently wanted to continue to live for some reason, they were given parachutes so that they could die sometime later in a meaningless way instead of giving their lives for science like heroes. In particular, 3 minutes before the crash, the 2 pilots and 1 engineer abandoned ship instead of going down with it, as every good captain should. From here, the plane was controlled remotely, making this airplane unequivocally tied for the coolest remote-controlled airplane in history. As for what the data revealed about the safest place to sit, they found, unsurprisingly, that those sitting closer to the front of the plane had the highest risk of injury or death. Those in the middle were, well, in the middle likelihood of injury or death, and those in the back would have likely been mostly fine in their crash. We'll dive into much more detail on the specific safest seat in a bit when looking at a larger accident safety set. They also found that the crash test dummies placed in the typically recommended brace position would have fewer head and spinal injuries, although interestingly more chance of breaking their legs than those who did not. Noteworthy, this wasn't actually the only time this sort of thing has been done, just the most advanced such test given modern technologies. Another similar one was conducted on December 1st, 1984 by NASA and the FAA, who intentionally crashed a Boeing 720 in the Mojave Desert. In this one, they were testing seatbelt setups, cabin structural integrity, as well as the effectiveness of the FM9 fuel additive that would reduce misting of the fuel in an accident to see if it would help in post-crash fires. This plane was fully remote controlled for the duration and was made to descend at a 3.8-degree glide scope, relatively typical for a real-world crash, although the gear was kept retracted. After the crash, the most important bit of data collected was that although about 25% of the passengers, rearward more likely, would have survived the crash based on bodily injury, given the amount of smoke, it was speculated that all aboard would have probably died before being able to get out because of this. As a result, the FAA began putting extra effort into reducing fires and such smoke via increased use of flame-retardant materials. They also began requiring R lighting to be mechanically attached to the flooring, not just attached via adhesives. Alright, so smoke is a major problem, and the back seats were the safest. But what about a broader sample set to try and fine-tune things a bit more? Well, enter a report by Popular Mechanics done in 2007, looking from accidents at 1971 on up to that point where someone had died but others had lived. As to why this specific dataset restriction, they were in essence wanting to know in severe accidents where people died, but it was in fact possible to survive. In this one, they found that those in first or business class had a 49% survival rate, those in the middle third of the plane had about a 56% survival rate, and those in the rear of the plane had a 69% survival rate. Nice. Although, interestingly, they found in their report that those with the highest fatality rates of all were actually those in the few rows in the absolute middle of the plane. This is hypothesized to be because of the wings being filled with fuel, or could have just been an aberration of the specific accidents looked at here, given that in the entire 36-year span they could only find 20 accidents that fit the criteria. Yet another analysis was compiled by Time in 2015, who no doubt wanted all of those sweet clicks the Popular Mechanics had gotten 8 years before. They looked at the previous 3.5 decades of commercial aviation accident data data in the United States, again looking at accidents that included both survivors and fatalities, in this case a sample size of 17 such accidents in their dataset. Much like popular mechanics, they also found the closer you are to the front of the plane, the more likely you are to die in such an accident. However, in their dataset, things didn't contrast quite so starkly as in popular mechanics' report, with those in the front third of the plane being 38% likely to die, those in the middle 1/3 of the plane at 39%, and those in the rear third of the plane at 32%. Diving into some of the nuance in all of this, those in the middle seats of a given row at any portion of the plane were safest of all, and going along with the idea that the rear of the plane is safest, unsurprisingly the middle seats in the back performed best of all here, with just a 28% fatality rate compared to, for example, the aisle seats in the middle of the plane at 44%. As to why, we can only assume having those sweet, soft bodies who have eaten way too much KFC in their lifetimes is a buffer between you and the wall and you and the stuff in the cabin, functioning like human airbags. Which, if you go check out our Higher Learning channel's video linked below, what's the best way to survive jumping out of a plane with no parachute, you'll find even in this extreme scenario, you don't actually need that many KFC lovers between you and the ground to survive. And should you want to give your life for your children, for some weird reason, putting your body between them and the ground actually gives them a surprisingly good chance of surviving. Going back to seat positions, there are outliers in all of this, and for example, in one crash in 1977, the infamous Tenerife disaster, the vast majority of the 61 survivors out of a total of 644 people involved were seated near the front in one of the planes involved, ensuring the wealthy continue to keep on keeping on, as it should be, instead of their plebeian brethren who are left in the dust where they belong. But to sum it up here, the statistically safest seat to sit on in a plane is the middle seat of the very back row. As to why, this generally just seems to come down to the entire front of the plane and all the meat sacks in it that provide a nice buffer between you and whatever the plane crashes against. Further, being in the back, there are fewer things to fly forward and hit you. Also, if you're in the very rear of the plane, there's generally an emergency exit right behind you, which is arguably one of the biggest factors in surviving a plane crash, according to one 2008 study performed by the University of Greenwich, which noted that being within 5 rows of an exit was statistically the safest place on the plane. Although, as noted, the mid-plane exit is not quite as safe as the others, again presumably owing to being just next to a wing with all of its fuel and potentially burning engines and other flying debris and stuff like that. In fact, it was just such flying debris that resulted in the death of the individual who has the dubious distinction of being the only person killed aboard a US-based commercial jet passenger plane in the last 15 years. On this, while many sources claim the number is still 0 since 2009, owing to it technically not being a crash, we feel it still qualifies given the event that caused it. The flight in question was Southwest Airlines 1380 in 2018, in which an uncontained engine failure resulted in flying debris that damaged the fuselage and the wing. This in turn resulted in explosive decompression in the cabin. Of the 149 aboard, 8 passengers were injured and 1 ultimately died from her injuries sustained when partially ejected from the airplane, although she was pulled back in by passengers and flight attendants. And that's it since 2009, 1 death, 15 years, 200 million flights. Of course, the back row isn't all good. While you will have both a higher likelihood of surviving a crash and are less likely to have people around you, with the back of the plane typically the most sparsely populated, in many planes the only non-emergency exit is up front, so you'll have to wait a lot longer to get off the plane. Further, you'll get jostled around a lot more by turbulence than, say, in the middle of the plane, where you can potentially reduce air sickness by picking that location. Further, going back to safety, for whatever it's worth, the air in the cabin, which is recycled every few minutes or so, also typically exits out the back of the plane. So technically, those in the very front of the plane might be slightly safer from coughing germs and the like, given the general rearward flow of air. Though, of course, this one is probably negligible overall given the way fresh air is distributed and the reality of it all from a practical standpoint. But we're already splitting hairs here about the likelihood of dying in a plane crash anyways, pandering to extreme irrational fears of flying, so we thought we'd throw the germaphobes among us an irrational bone to chew on as well. Plus, you are vastly more likely to die of things like the flu than you are of a plane crash. So we thought it remiss not to at least bring up getting sick from other passengers as one of the real dangers of commercial flight, even if it's minuscule. Either way, as ever, once again showing why you should never leave your house. There are literally people out there. And don't even get us started on the sun and its quest to kill us all. On that note, one study done by Emory University in 2018, looking at transmission of various infections aboard commercial airliners, found that those in the aisle seats had an average of 64 potential contact moments versus those in the middle seat at 58 versus the window seats at 12. As to why, they noted that by sitting next to the window, you are as far away as possible from passengers and crew walking up and down the aisle, with each extra bit of distance away from other passengers massively decreasing the likelihood of getting sick from one of those humans. Of course, there is something a lot more deadly than a common cold and more likely than a plane crash to contend with when flying, and that's venous thromboembolism, or VTE, or sometimes known as economy class syndrome, in which a blood clot can form in your veins from sitting unmoved for extended. Of course, there is something a lot more deadly than a common cold and more likely than a plane crash to contend with when flying, and that's venous thromboembolism, or VTE, or sometimes known as economy class syndrome, in which a blood clot can form in your veins from sitting unmoved for extended periods and exacerbated somewhat by the ultra-dry air dehydrating you insanely quickly, which is in part why airlines push so many beverages on you. While it's notoriously difficult to track how common VTE is as a result of flights, given symptoms for it may not show up for quite some time after, in one aptly named study, Venous Thrombolism Prophylaxis on Flights, done in 2018, it indicated that somewhere in the realm of one passenger for every 4,500 flights will develop symptoms from this within 8 weeks following a long-haul flight, and that the increase in risk factor of such flights is about 2.8 times the normal populace. So coming back to which seat you should pick to maximize odds of not dying, as you might expect from the moniker economy class syndrome, those with more legroom and ability to get up and stretch seem to have far fewer instances of this. Unsurprisingly from this, you are twice as likely to develop VTE if you have a window seat than an aisle seat. This is generally thought to be because aisle seat individuals, by necessity, have to stand up more than those who have window seats. This is not just for themselves, but because they often have to stand up to let other people in and out of the aisle because, like a toddler, those selfish individuals didn't think to use the restroom before their flight. An aisle seat passenger is also able to occasionally stretch their legs into the aisle and try to trip people for something to do during the flight, whereas many window seat passengers cannot easily stretch their legs much or even at all unless they're a member of the ruling class up front. That said, with a window seat, you get to enjoy a view that only the last few generations of humans have been able to experience, with throughout the few 100,000 years before, the humans just having to envy the birds. So, pros and cons of all these factors in seat position with regards to safety in flight. But, in the general case, sitting in the back is going to be better if you do get into an accident. And if the plane isn't full, the whole VTE issue may not be, as quite often the back is relatively empty, allowing you all the benefits of a window seat but still able to stretch out and get up and go up and down as you please, as well as avoid repulsive human contact and, the worst thing of all, potentially having to speak with another human. That said, a major negative about sitting in the back that is generally kept quiet by the authorities is it puts you behind the point of the plane where the mind-controlling chemtrails are distributed, with of course the distribution being an integral part of all pilot training, going back to one of the first ever known mentions of chemtrails in October of 1918 by one Captain Ward Wells. To quote him, "Our attention was first drawn to the sky by the sudden appearance of several strange and startling clouds, long, graceful, looping ribbons of white. These were tapering to a point at one end, and at the other, where they dissolved into nothingness 60 degrees beyond the sky, were about as broad as the width of a finger held arm's distance from the eye. On close observation, we noticed some distance ahead of each cloud point the tiny speck of a chase plane. Apparently, the churning of the air was all that was needed to upset the delicately balanced meteorological conditions and precipitate this strange cloud formation. I had seen ships leave their tracks in the clouds similar to those of little sea animals in the wet sands at the shore, but never before had I seen a plane writing in white upon the blue slate of the sky." End quote. Of course, also part of the training even back then, as observed in Captain Wells's explanation, is apologetics, to explain away what the pilots are all doing here in helping to prepare human minds for the coming invasion. And if you're wondering what chemtrails, also called contrails, actually are, well, they're either the result of condensation trails resulting from a drop in air pressure that can, in the right conditions, cause the temperature of the air to temporarily drop below the dew point around certain parts of the plane, or they are a byproduct of burning jet fuel, introducing water to said air that also, once it cools down a bit, condenses around nucleation sites and at high altitudes often ultimately freezes. This is not totally dissimilar to breathing out of your mouth when it's freezing and there's a vapor cloud forming there. Or, it's mind-controlling chemicals, whatever you like. As an interesting brief aside on this, if you notice that contrails above you form and then dissipate quickly, you can likely expect a continuation of clear weather that day, whereas if the contrails stick around for a long time and are seen to expand greatly in the interim, it means that the air in high altitude is likely very humid, increasing the chances that you may have clouds, rain, or storms on the horizon. All you know is Bill Gates making sure that we use Microsoft Windows or something like that. How not to die in an aviation accident, other ways to survive a plane crash. Okay, going back to surviving plane crashes, it turns out there are a number of other things you can do here besides sit with all the cool kids in the back. The number one way being by, shocker, paying attention to the safety briefing required at the start of each flight, which most people don't. In this briefing, they'll point out things like the position you should get yourself into if the plane might crash, which we'll get into a bit more in the bonus facts. But in general, this brace position is achieved with your head between your knees and your hands over the back of your head to protect things hitting your brain canister from behind. Noteworthy, it is generally recommended that you put one hand over the other rather than interlacing your fingers in order to help protect at least one of your hands somewhat as well. This one, perhaps more than anything else with regards to increasing your chance of surviving a crash, is the thing you want to pay most attention to. Not just noting the location of the exits, but actually taking the time to count the number of rows from you to the one in front and the one behind you, because in a crash the cabin can become filled with quite deadly and visibility obscuring smoke among other hazards of staying aboard. Thus, in general, if you survive the initial crash, the best way to survive after is to get off the plane as fast as possible before you extremely rapidly succumb to the fumes. And that means finding the closest exit as fast as possible when you may not be able to see much of anything, hence why memorizing the number of rows to an exit is also recommended so that you can count them as you crawl along. The importance of getting off the plane as fast as possible is also why regulatory bodies like the FAA require that every plane be able to be fully evacuated within 90 seconds. This is somewhat of an arbitrary number, as we'll get into in fascinating deals in the bonus facts in a bit. It is unlikely that in a real-world crash that it's actually possible to evacuate people in this time frame in many cases. Going back to the safety briefing, it turns out every item in there is in there for a reason. It's shocking, we know. And that includes how to use the emergency oxygen masks and telling you to give it a tug or it won't work and putting yours on first, even before your kids. This is owing to the fact that at high altitudes, like a typical cruise of 35,000 feet, you'll only have about 15 to 60 seconds of useful consciousness to get that mask on before you go all loopy and then pass out. Once your mask is on, you can then safely get your kids' masks on, even if they've already passed out. And speaking of those masks, as an interesting brief aside, it turns out they aren't hooked up to any central oxygen tank or anything, but rather when you tug the device, it triggers a spring-loaded mechanism that sets off an explosive charge. This triggers a mixture of lead stiphanate and tetrazine to generate the needed heat to produce a chemical reaction that produces oxygen for your mask. This is why they tell you to tug on the mask to get the oxygen flowing. You've got to set off the explosive charge to get the whole thing working. That's right, what you breathe through the mask didn't begin as pure oxygen. Rather, the plane is equipped with numerous small chemical oxygen generators, also known as oxygen candles, about the size of a small package of tennis balls. These contain a mixture of mostly sodium chlorate and less than 5% barium peroxide and less than 1% potassium perchlorate. When these chemicals are heated up by the lead stiphanate and tetrazine, each undergoes a reaction that ultimately results in a fair bit of filtered, life-sustaining oxygen running through the tube to you. Of course, you might also smell a faint burning odor, but this is nothing to be alarmed about. It just assures you that the system is working. In fact, if the plane is actually on fire, the masks usually won't deploy as to not make the fire worse with the extra oxygen. You may pass out in this case, but rest assured if the plane is on fire, the pilots will immediately execute whatever procedure for that particular aircraft that gets it down on the ground as fast as physically possible without ripping the wings off. Fires in planes, it's no bueno. And it's unlikely that you'll actually die in the interim of getting to a safe, breathable altitude, even of starting at 35,000 feet. Going back to airline accident safety, a couple of things not mentioned in the safety briefing, but also generally recommended, are to keep your shoes on during the most dangerous parts of flight in takeoff and landing, avoiding wearing baggy clothing, and in particular polyester or nylon or other such synthetic fibers that would like nothing better than to burn and melt against your skin while they do it. Also avoid anything sharp in your pockets, etc., etc. But in the end, given the extreme safety of commercial air travel, many would argue that the rational thing is just not to worry about any of this, outside of paying attention to the safety briefing. The back middle seat may be the safest, but the likelihood of this mattering at all on any given flight is so small that it would be irrational to prioritize this over sitting in the front of the plane, sipping champagne with the other members of the ruling class, leaving the plebs their pitiful sense of security in their cramped rear seats. On this note, given how insanely safe flying is, you might be wondering what is the absolute best way to get over your fears and enjoy the ride. Beyond just studying all about the safety aspects of flight and what the pilots are doing and all of it, as well as flying frequently, arguably the greatest thing you can do if you have the means, which combines both of these things in a more extreme environment, is go take some flight instruction at your local flight school. Even if you have no intention of becoming a pilot, it doesn't take that many lessons of training before your fear of flying will disappear completely, especially aboard the bastions of safety that are large commercial planes. And hey, you get some fun experience out of it too. And if you happen to follow through to getting a pilot's license, you too can now join boat lovers in chronically seeing your bank account hovering near zero because of your newfound hobby. But you only live once, might as well enjoy the ride until you inevitably cease to exist and all memory or record of you is forgotten in a rather rapid time span. And now some bonus facts. How the engines provide the oxygen you're breathing. In most modern airliners, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner notwithstanding, outside air is bled off from the compressor stage of the turbine engines and eventually piped into the passenger areas. However, a bit of processing is needed first, as the compressed air is extremely hot, on the order of nearly 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees Celsius. Thus, before it enters the passenger compartment, it is first allowed to expand and run through a heat exchanger and air cycle system to cool it off sufficiently. This system can also work as a heater, with some of the hot air mixed in with the cooled air to regulate cabin temperature. Engineers are just the best, aren't they? Once cooled and filtered, the pressurized air, which has now got sufficient oxygen density to keep people happily conscious, is piped into the cabin area, usually at levels of around 12 psi, equivalent to the atmospheric pressure of about 7,000 feet. So why 12 psi instead of something like sea level pressure of about 14.7 psi? Well, 12 psi is sufficient for the majority of passengers while simultaneously reducing the structural strain on the aircraft itself over something like sea level atmospheric pressures. As for the air already in the cabin, this is vented out through an outflow valve or multiple valves in larger aircraft, usually located near the rear of the plane. And fun fact here, before smoking was banned on commercial aircraft, the area around this outflow valve was generally stained dark brown from tobacco smoke. The outflow valve opens and closes automatically to maintain a steady pressure inside the cabin, while the entire system is ensuring that fresh air is continually being piped in and eventually blown out the back of the aircraft. In fact, while many complain of airplanes seeming stuffy, this system ensures that all the air in the aircraft is being completely replaced on average every 2 to 3 minutes. Yep, that means that your car, house, or office is likely significantly more stuffy than a commercial airplane flying at 35,000 feet. First person ever killed in a plane crash. While one's definition of a plane, and what was the first one, varies based on people who don't know what they're talking about, the Wright brothers are generally given credit here owing to the fact that their craft was not only powered and capable of carrying a person, but it was also fully controllable, and the 3-axis system they developed to achieve this is not too dissimilar to the way planes are controlled today, along with a slew of other features later adopted from their design, separating their craft from those of antiquity that didn't change the world. And this brings us to the first ever person killed in a plane crash, or at least a plane as we think of it. This was one Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, who was flying with Wilbur Wright on September the 17th, 1908, in front of a cheering crowd of over 2,000 people. After a few laps around the gathered masses, a mechanical failure resulted in a subsequent propeller brake, which then cut a wire bracing the vertical rudder. This all, in turn, caused the plane to pitch straight to the ground. Wilbur did slightly recover control before hitting the ground, but not enough, and Selfridge and himself were thrown from the wreckage. Wilbur survived the incident, but Selfridge's head struck a piece of the wood framing as he was thrown from the craft, cracking his skull. He later died in the hospital. It is generally thought that had he been wearing a helmet, he likely would have survived the crash, as the rest of his injuries, while non-trivial, were not considered life-threatening. It was partly because of Lieutenant Selfridge's death and how he died that when the army started sending pilots up in planes, they were required to wear thick headgear for protection. Human sardines. Alright, going back to the crash position. It turns out the same reason your seat won't necessarily line up with the window on a given plane has resulted in many no longer being able to execute the recommended crash position, namely airlines cramming many more seats than their original designers recommended into their planes, which is a rather easy thing to do because the seats are simply sitting on tracks and can be easily set in a variety of arrangements, as well as the distance between the rows being flexible. Toward this end, only a few decades ago, the average pitch between seats on a commercial aircraft was 34 inches, but today it's diminished to just 31 inches, with even 28-inch seats being relatively common. Airlines are not only shrinking the pitch between the seats, but also, in some cases, the width, despite the general populace's ever-expanding girth. For instance, while 18 inches was more or less the norm for economy class, 18.5 inches still being the recommendation by Boeing for economy class seats on the 777, rows as narrow as 16.7 inches are not unheard of today. If narrowed enough on certain planes, this allows for an extra seat in each row. For example, the Airbus A330 was designed to have 8 seats in a row, but it's not uncommon for airlines to use thinner than recommended width of seats to accommodate 9 seats in a row on this aircraft. And if you were wondering, according to Cynthia Corbett of the FAA, there is no set rule for how many passengers and seats can be crammed onto commercial aircraft, and the exit rows are even allowed to have the seats block the exit by up to 50%. The only caveat, as previously noted, that the FAA requires is that all commercial aircraft be able to be fully evacuated in less than 90 seconds, even with half the exits blocked. This must be demonstrated by manufacturers in both computer-simulated and live tests. While no regulatory body is much concerned with the windows lining up with the seats on commercial aircraft, numerous consumer issues concerning the current state of airline travel in the United States did spark the formation of the Department of Transportation's Advisory Committee for Aviation Consumer Protection in 2012. In 2015, they specifically began looking in-depth at airlines cramming more and more people into flights, and in the process uncovered many safety issues that results from this. To begin with, the aforementioned recommended crash position that has been proven to minimize injury and death in the event of an airplane crash is to bend forward with essentially your head in your lap. The problem is that with the ever-diminishing pitch, especially in more extreme cases like 28-inch pitch, more and more people cannot physically assume this position given how close the seat in front of them is, or at least without putting their head and neck in a very precarious position. This is compounded by the fact that the new slimline seats with hard rather than padded backs, allowing the saving a couple of inches per seat to be able to accommodate more seats, have been introduced. So in the event of a crash, not only can those of the taller persuasion not necessarily assume the crash position, they are at risk that they'll smack their head against a hard seat back in front of them in these types of emergency situations. Another issue addressed by Dr. Nimia El Reyes during the aviation consumer protection meetings is the aforementioned potentially life-threatening venous thrombosis. With less space for an individual to move their legs in flights over 4 hours long, studies have shown a significant increase in instances of this condition in recent years. Two of the primary risk factors here are duration of the flight and height of the individual. Essentially, the longer you sit and the more tightly packed you are, the more likely you are to develop this condition. Government Affairs Association of Professional Flight Attendants representative Julie Frederick also noted while addressing the Advisory Committee for Aviation Consumer Protection that the present high-density passenger seating has led to a rapid rise in air rage incidents, which are generally centered around personal space issues. Most notable among the triggers for these incidents is a passenger leaning their seat back, resulting in approximately 3/4 of all reported air rage incidents today. Due to the decreasing pitch, there often simply isn't any room to lean back without ramming your seat into the knees of the person behind you. In the case of individuals over 6 feet tall, their knees may already be pressed up against the upright seats with no room whatsoever for the person in front to recline. This inevitably results in no doubt Seinfeld-esque arguments over who has the right to those few inches of space. 90 seconds. As previously mentioned, there is a requirement that all planes must be able to be evacuated in under 90 seconds, including demonstrating this in computer simulations and live tests. However, there is significant controversy over these tests. While the testers do many things to simulate a real crash evacuation, the live testing scenarios can never actually accurately simulate real-world crash scenarios owing to safety concerns for the test subjects. Nevertheless, the testers do try via randomly blocking half the exits. Not even the flight attendants know which will be blocked in a given test, restricting visibility by using emergency lighting only, using humans of all ages in the tests, including dummy infants for some people to carry, and randomly placing luggage around the cabin and aisles. Of course, even with all this, the passengers all know they are there for evacuation testing, so actually pay attention to the normal evacuation instructions, something real-world passengers almost never do. They're calm, they think rationally, there is no smoke or any other such visual or breathing impairments, no one is injured, they're not trying to get to their children, perhaps in another row away from the closest exit before evacuating, and they must pass a physical fitness test before being allowed to be a test passenger, so they don't really accurately represent the general public. Unsurprisingly from this, a 2013 Canadian Safety Board study determines that in real-world evacuations, the 90-second evacuation time is rarely met, even though many planes don't fly full and accidents don't necessarily block or disable half the exits. While this is a concern, Corbett noted that 90 seconds is not some magic safety number. It's just a relatively low number to make sure manufacturers at least put some effort into making sure passengers can exit a plane quickly in the event of an emergency. Specifically, the time was set somewhat arbitrarily based on one primary factor: fire. The flash burn fire event time on a typical aircraft when the rule was instituted was about 120 seconds. Further, as previously alluded to, if you happen to survive a significant plane crash, by far the most dangerous thing for you in most cases is smoke inhalation. So getting out to fresh air as rapidly as possible is key to minimizing passenger deaths that occur after a crash. It should also be noted that according to Frederick, in her 35 years of experience in the flight attendant industry, it isn't an accurate assessment to assume people will panic in the event of a crash, even a major one. In fact, she states that in such situations, most people actually go into, as she described it, a space-out mode, which is why flight attendants are trained to shout instructions at passengers to break them out of their trance and get them doing what they're supposed to do. Essentially, in her experience, in real-world accidents, many people's reaction is to just freeze and not do anything unless they are told. Eternal sleep. One more little data point to think about when you're irrationally fearing flying is that every day you do something far more dangerous, and that's going to bed. It turns out that about 1 in every 2,700 people in the US will die of falling out of bed or off other furniture, or about 1,500 people per year, massively eclipsing the death rates in commercial passenger aviation. Of course, just about everybody lays in bed at night. We just wanted to remind everyone that every single time you lay down at night to practice for your eventual eternal sleep, you might actually find that practice turns into the real thing, thanks to the countless ways humans' incredibly fragile warm-blooded meat and water sacs can cease to function at any time. So thanks for watching this to the end. If you watched this while falling asleep, maybe even your end. Good night, everybody. Just before we dive in today, got a huge shout out to our sponsor, Conflict of Nations. Have you ever wanted to lead your own country to victory in modern global warfare? Well, probably not in real life, but that's where Conflict of Nations comes in. A free online PvP strategy game where you're not just playing, you are dominating. Conflict of Nations lets you choose a real country, build your army, and engage in battles that can last 4 weeks. Tanks, jets, nuclear submarines, you name it, you command it. And the best part, you can declare war on your neighbors or form alliances with other players. It's like a global chess game, but with way cooler pieces. You've got complete freedom to shape your own strategy. Whether you're into long-term planning, PvP showdowns, or real-time action, Conflict of Nations has got you covered. And you can seamlessly switch between PC and mobile. Click on the link below to get 13,000 gold and a free 1-month premium subscription. It's only available for the next 30 days, so don't miss out. And now, let's get into today's video. For Trevor Locke, Wednesday the 30th of April was a day that began like any other. He was a police officer of London's Metropolitan Police Force, and at that time, he was assigned to diplomatic protection duty, specifically at the Iranian embassy. There, he couldn't believe his luck. Days that used to be spent chasing crims through London's dirty streets and occasionally getting 10 bells beaten out of him were now spent bimbling about in a bougie marble-clad foyer, wherein the greatest stress of his day was deciding which artisan coffee he fancied from the embassy's barista. His luck, however, wasn't to last long, as on that fateful day, the once calm and placid surrounds of the embassy became the scene of the single most tense situation of his entire career, when at 11:30 a.m., the public entrance was smashed open by a mighty kick, and in poured 6 armed men stacked with machine guns and grenades. Keen to let everyone know they meant business, they wasted no time. 5 of the men immediately fanned out and encouraged everyone present to back away from the door at muzzle point. At the same time, the final man, the group's leader, pointed his own machine gun toward the ceiling and dumped an entire magazine into it. In the first few seconds that it took for that scene to play out, Trevor had abandoned his cappuccino and placed his gaze on the gunman, and now he faced a burning dilemma as tucked out of sight under his shirt was a revolver, ready and primed with 6 rounds, 1 for each of the gunmen. So did he try to drop them, or did he play it cool? In the end, the gunman answered that question for him, as Trevor soon found himself with the muzzle of a machine gun pressed into his temple, the operator of which barked a very clear instruction at him: hands up or die. And so, with no other option, Trevor complied, but not before he subtly jigged himself around to hide his revolver in the folds of his uniform, a move that proved most clever because he got through a hasty pat down without it being detected, and so found himself in the heart of the building with the rest of the hostages, revolver still on his person. It had taken only minutes for that scene to play out, in which time the embassy had been completely secured by the gunman from top to bottom, and now 26 hostages were at their mercy, Trevor among them. The immediate scene was tense, to say the least, in no small part due to the skittish nature of some of the gunmen, one of whom, despite having all 26 hostages clearly subdued, took to strolling around the silent and still mass of people, shoving a grenade in their faces and removing and replacing the pin over and over again, all the while screaming violent threats at them. As for what these gunmen wanted, well, that question was answered by an interview with the group's leader, Owan Ali Mohammed, better known by his call sign of Salim, which he gave to the BBC immediately after taking over the embassy.
Why have you taken hostages inside the embassy?
Because we had some demand to get what we want. The free of 91 prisoners.
You want 91 prisoners in Iran to be set free?
Yeah. You know, that's a group who are fighting for their legitimate rights. Just this. And they are fighting for the autonomy for Arabistan.
By Arabistan, he meant Khuzestan, a western province of Iran with a sizable Arab population, and one that his group, the Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan, wanted to make an independent state. The police had been made aware of the situation immediately via silent alarm, and in response, they immediately dispatched their counter-terror team under the command of Deputy Assistant Commissioner John Dello. Certainly, this was no weak body of men. It was comprised of officers, many of whom happened to be military veterans, and all of whom had access to the best training and equipment that the Metropolitan Police could muster. But still, despite this, the powers that be, namely Richard Hasty Smith, chair of the Cabinet Office Briefing Rooms, COBR, the British Government's Crisis Coordination Centre, and Francis Pym, Secretary of State for Defence, had their doubts about the police's ability to rescue the hostages. The threat before them was simply so unprecedented and so great. In response to this niggling doubt, they pressed their minds for a more suitable group that they could hand the operation over to. But they needed the best, the hardiest, the most absolute of units, men with a proven track record of succeeding in combat against insurmountable odds. But wherever would they find such men? Well, such men, it turned out, were 150 miles to the west, in the picturesque and little historic city of Hereford, because there sat a small and unassuming military installation known as Bradbury Lines, the garrison of a little outfit that you might have heard of, the Special Air Service, or SAS, and ultimately it would fall to them to bring the situation under control. At that time, 22 SAS B Squadron had just been assigned to counter-terrorism duties, having just finished a stint overseas in a classified place doing classified things. Such an assignment was typically a welcome one, as it meant that they would remain UK-based for several months, and so would get to partake in luxuries such as actually seeing their families from time to time, and occasionally, with a bit of luck, maybe even having a bit of a social life on the weekend. For this reason, as the troopers scrambled for their gear and sped down the motorway towards London, the mood was very much one of annoyance, as weekend leave was now cancelled. But if there is one quality one needs to be an SAS trooper, it is professionalism. So they buried their annoyance and steeled themselves for the task at hand. When they arrived on the scene, their first port of call was scribbling out an immediate action plan, a hastily drawn together scheme that they could implement immediately, lest the situation deteriorate before a proper assault plan could be put together. From there, they gathered intelligence and began forming their actual plan. This involved studying the building's plans and quizzing anyone they could get their hands on who knew the ins and outs of its layout. Basically, the troopers wanted such an in-depth knowledge of its shape and form that were they to be hypothetically dropped into it blindfolded, they'd be able to navigate their way back out of the building without bumping into a single wall. Such was the level of awareness they wanted before going in. There were also much more hands-on aspects to their planning. At night, troopers would descend onto the building and have a poke at the various windows, walls, and skylights to figure out which represented their best possible points of entry. But still, despite the meticulous efforts the SAS were putting into their plan, everyone else on the scene still hoped they wouldn't actually have to go in. They all still dreamed that the situation could be brought to a peaceful resolution. The SAS were there just as a last resort in case that dream couldn't be realized. Unfortunately, though, fate would not allow a happy ending, and so soon enough the SAS would be given the green light to attack. The standoff dragged out for many days, but despite this, Salim still thought he was the one in control. He was convinced that the British government was paralysed by fear, and that so long as he had his hostages, he would soon enough get his way. Unfortunately for him, his assessment of that situation was very, very wrong. In reality, the only reason his lungs still drew breath was due to the good graces of the British government, who had a long-standing policy of not escalating hostage situations so long as the perpetrators didn't start killing their prisoners. Unaware of that, and convinced that the British government just needed a little nudge of encouragement to make them properly bend the knee, Salim made a fatal miscalculation on day 6 of the siege. He killed a hostage. That hostage was Abbas Lavasani, the embassy's chief press officer. When looking for someone to kill, he was a no-brainer choice for Salim. Lavasani was an ardent supporter of the 1979 Iranian Revolution, a fact he made apparent throughout the siege, as he would constantly berate and make verbal jabs at the hostage takers, telling them all about how wonderful he thought Ayatollah Khomeini was and how lucky they were as Arabs to find themselves under his rule. Slim had found himself with the urge to kill him on day one because of this, but he repressed his violent urges to maintain Lavasani's value as a hostage. But now that Slim had decided he needed someone to kill, Lavasani was out of luck. And so, at exactly 13:45, he was dragged out to the entrance foyer, knelt down, and shot 3 times. Once in the chest, twice in the head. His body was then dumped unceremoniously out the front entrance. Unbeknown to him, Slim had just signed his own death warrant. Sir David McNee, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, upon seeing the grisly act play out before him, immediately requested to hand the operation over to the army, a request that Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher granted without a second's hesitation. Slim, however, was convinced that his act of barbarism had given him the upper hand in the negotiations, as he stated the following to the police.
Calm down, Slim. Yeah, we don't calm down. Calm down. We will kill one after 40 minutes from 29. Now, the time is...
Salim, are you still there?
No, we will kill the other.
Look.
We are very sorry. We are very sorry.
When the meeting...
No.
Given that Slim had now proven he was perfectly willing to kill his hostages, the SAS were understandably keen to get into the embassy before those 45 minutes were up, but they needed time to get into position, so they instructed the police negotiators to pretend that they had given up, to tell Slim that all of his demands were being met and that the Iraqi ambassador was on his way, a plane had been arranged to take them out of the country, and that a coach was on its way to take them to it. Despite the negotiators' best efforts, however, Slim wasn't buying their bluff about the demands being met. The atmosphere in the embassy had changed, and everyone present, both hostages and hostage-takers alike, knew that something was about to happen. Panicking, Slim tried to prevent whatever it was by sticking his machine gun into Trevor Locke's face, walking him over to the phone and forcing him to negotiate on his behalf.
Hello, Salim. Hello, sir. This is Trevor. Hello, Trevor. He's told me, he's insisted that I come down and speak to you and tell you directly that if anything is done via attack, all hostages will be killed.
All we're trying to organize, Trevor, is the coach and the aircraft and the movement of the Iraqi ambassador.
This did little to reassure Slim, however, and so he later took to the phone to personally tell negotiators that he knew that they were up to something.
We are listening to some suspicion movement.
There is no suspicious movement.
There's suspicion. Okay.
Salim.
Just a minute, I'll come back again. I'm going to check.
At the very moment, at 7:23 p.m., as Slim dropped the phone and turned to go check, all hell broke loose. The sound of an enormous explosion ripped through the embassy as the roof skylights were blown up, a move intended to throw both Slim and the other hostage-takers off guard and create a point of entry. A section of 4 troopers then chucked a volley of flashbangs in, just in case any gunmen were lying in wait, and then penetrated the building in the wake of their detonation. The confusion caused by this initial explosion was then further amplified by Trevor Locke, because he now had the perfect opportunity to pounce on Slim, and that's exactly what he did. To quote him, "I ran as hard as I could towards him and managed to hit him with my shoulders in the hip, and I ran him back maybe 8 to 10 feet. Then I headed him. We were facing the door. He was going nowhere." As that was happening, troopers were on the balcony with orders to blow up the windows and penetrate that way. They had intended to set off their charges at the exact same time as those on the roof for maximum confusion, but they encountered a problem. As they were laying the charges, the curtains on the other side of the window were suddenly flung open. On instinct, the trooper not laying the charges shouldered his MP5, ready to drop the terrorist he assumed was revealing himself, but much to his surprise, it was one of the hostages, specifically Simeon Harris, a BBC sound recorder, who had found himself in the room and upon hearing the shuffling around, had decided whoever was on the other side was his ticket to freedom. Harris promptly turned his underpants a deep shade of brown at the side, but after a few moments he put his mind back to escape and began banging on the window to get their help. All the while, the troopers on the other side of the window were desperately screaming at him to back up and get behind something solid before they blew the window up, a message that had difficulty being understood thanks to the muffling generated by their gas masks and the thick window. Suitably dramatic hand gestures conveyed the message soon enough, however, and with that, they blew the window, got Harris to safety, and penetrated the building only a minute or so later than planned. The third team also made their move, with their approach being to abseil down onto the rear balcony and penetrate that way. But they too encountered a setback, as one of them had gotten his glove tangled up in his rope during the descent. Normally, this would be a mere annoyance, that either be a man down or be delayed as they cut him free, but due to one certain extra detail, this setback had the potential to be fatal. That being that the curtains on the balcony were now on fire, and the flames were rapidly rising to the trooper's level. His comrades looked on from below as flames began to consume him and his screams filled the radio, but there was nothing they could do. To make matters worse, troopers on the roof couldn't even cut him free because he was desperately trying to kick himself away from the wall to escape the flames, which was making him swing over the edge of the balcony and thus risking a 40-foot drop onto solid concrete if he was cut free at the wrong time. With no other options, the troopers on the roof steeled themselves, took the only course of action open to them, waiting until he lost his footing and then cutting him free as momentum carried him back through the flames and over the balcony. They did this successfully, and the trooper landed on the balcony, caught safely by his mates. But having suffered second-degree burns all up his legs, did he sit out the rest of the operation? No, of course he didn't. He brushed himself off, shouldered his MP5, and joined the rest of the team in penetrating the building. The other trooper teams, namely that final one on the roof and a further two that were penetrating via the back doors at ground level, got inside without incident. While all of this was happening, Trevor Locke was still locked in his furious melee with Salim. The pair wrestled and exchanged blows for what felt like an eternity, but soon enough, when Salim was momentarily distracted by the ever closer sounds of the approaching SAS troopers, Trevor broke free, kicked away from him, drew the revolver he had kept hidden for so long, and shoved it into Salim's temple. The tables had now turned, and did Salim manage to maintain the poise and dignity that Trevor has when he had a muzzle shoved in his face? No. Instead, he wept and begged, spinning a desperate lie about how he had been the moderate voice of calm during the siege, the one who called for them to surrender and give in. Despite seeing immediately through Salim's crock of lies, Trevor was a merciful soul, so he didn't shoot him. Instead, he simply put him in a headlock, kept the muzzle of his revolver pressed into his head, and told him to shut up and not move. By the time this was all done, the SAS teams were deep into the building. Their approach was a simple but effective one. Having penetrated in groups of 4, they then subdivided up into pairs. One pair would clear a room by first throwing in some flashbangs and then storm in while laying down a hail of bullets. Then, with that room cleared, the other pair would move past them and do the same in the next room while the first pair covered their rear. The two pairs then repeated this pattern, leapfrogging their way through the building until the whole thing was clear. This approach might sound odd at first because it invariably meant that hostages would end up getting flashbanged, but this was no oversight and was actually a very intentional choice. You see, they'd rather flashbang everyone than no one in that situation, because if they just booted the doors open and stormed in the old-fashioned way, the hostage takers would then have a small window of opportunity to turn their guns on the hostages before being gunned down themselves, and it was far better for the hostages to be flashbanged than shot. The SAS rightly reasoned. As they went through the building room by room, the troopers soon enough happened upon Trevor Locke, who still had Salim restrained, and when the flashbangs came rolling in, their detonation threw Trevor off guard, and so Salim took the opportunity to break free of his grip and make a dash for his machine gun, which stood propped up in the corner of the room. He didn't manage, however. Trevor had managed to grab his wrist as he leapt away, and he desperately strained to pull him away from the gun. The troopers entered the room and barked a simple order at the brave officer, "Trevor!" on the floor. He obeyed instantly, and as he hit the ground, the trooper's mag dumped into Salim, killing him instantly. Trevor's role in the siege was now done, and after receiving a pat on the back from the troopers, he was escorted out of the building via the balcony. 4 more hostage takers would be killed as the SAS pushed ever on. One died quickly and without quibble. He had tried fortifying himself in a far-off cupboard, intent on ambushing the troopers when they breached the room, but the flashbang spoiled that plan, and he was shot dead while disorientated. Another one tried a more bold strategy, standing up loudly and proudly as he waved a hand grenade around and announced his intent to pull the pin if any funny business was tried. Unfortunately for him, real life isn't a Hollywood movie, so rather than his monologue being met with a monologue from the troopers as he presumably planned, he was simply pushed down the flight of stairs that he was stood atop, and when he landed at the bottom, 3 troopers dumped their mags into him. The 27 rounds that connected killed him instantly. There was then a further 2 holed up in a room on the 2nd floor with 9 hostages. They had twigged in advance that the SAS were outside and about to breach the room, so they turned their guns on the hostages, hitting Ali Akbar Samadejder, an embassy staffer, and Ahmed Dagdar, the embassy's medical advisor. Ali died immediately, but Ahmed, despite being shot 6 times, miraculously survived. After this, the 2 terrorists threw their guns from the window, knelt down with their hands on their head, and awaited their fate. They had expected to be taken alive, but the troopers, upon seeing Ali's lifeless body, put them up against the wall and shot them dead. That left just 1 terrorist still alive. Unlike his comrades, he tried to be clever about it and attempted to escape the SAS onslaught by disguising himself among the hostages, and this worked for a time. But unfortunately for him, the SAS's procedure during hostage rescues was to handcuff everybody pulled from the scene until all the perpetrators could be accounted for alive or dead. Because of this, he made it as far as the embassy's rear garden, at which point the genuine hostages immediately fingered him. He did have some luck, however, because as a trooper pulled him to his feet and began to push him back towards the embassy, for no particular reason, that trooper was reminded that hundreds of cameras were currently trained on them, and so a quick U-turn was made to a nearby police van, and he was thrown into it, alive and well. And with that, the siege was over, and the SAS withdrew at 1940, a mere 17 minutes after they first went in. Now, all in all, Operation Nimrod was considered by most to be a roaring success. A situation that could have, and by nearly all metrics should have, ended in a complete massacre was brought to an end with a minimal loss of civilian life. 23 had been saved with injuries no greater than some minor ear-ringing from flashbang exposure, and one had been saved despite suffering horrific gunshot wounds, and one tragically had died, in addition to Labasani, prior to the assault. But despite this, the operation did prove a tad controversial at the time, and the SAS was subject to a smidge of criticism in its wake, primarily on account of the 2 hostage takers that were killed after they had surrendered. Nothing much came of it, however. There was some heavy tutting and finger-wagging in a couple of newspaper columns, but that was about it. The government, for their part, couldn't be more pleased with the lads from B Squadron, with both the Queen and Margaret Thatcher personally making an appearance at their base the evening of the operation to thank them in person and put their credit cards behind the bar in the mess. As for the public, both in the UK and overseas, they were simply in awe of the SAS, and as a result, they became overnight celebrities. We're willing to bet that you were fully aware of the SAS before you even clicked on this video. And now, you know where it all began. Every SAS veteran who cashes in their service for instant fame, every small business that makes an SAS-related pun out of its name for free advertising, every television show that crams the SAS into its premise to pull in viewers, and every video game that finds an excuse to crowbar the SAS into its story to spice things up, all goes back to Operation Nimrod and the permanent imprint its awesome spectacle left on popular culture.
And that's the end of today's video. Just a quick reminder at the end here to check out Conflict of Nations, the free online PvP strategy game happening in modern global warfare. Grab your exclusive gift of 13,000 gold and a month premium subscription for free. Offer available only for 30 days. Click that link below and I'll catch you on the battlefield.
In our lead story today, we're going to bring you to the sky above Lebanon, where the thunder and bellow of Israeli air attacks has grown louder and louder in recent days. Israel has spent months prosecuting a brutal offensive in the Palestinian territory of Gaza, working to root out the militant terror group Hamas. But for most of that time, Israel has also withstood nagging rocket attacks and skirmishes from a close Hamas ally. That ally, Lebanon's political and militant organization Hezbollah, has spent recent weeks escalating violence with Israel, and now Israel. On both sides of the Atlantic, it's been a cherished dream for decades. The dream of a Europe that's not just an economic power, but a military one too. A Europe that invests so much in defense that it can handle a local war with only minimal help from Uncle Sam. For Americans, this dream is seductive because it posits a world in which Washington is freed up to focus solely on the Indo-Pacific. For Europeans, it offers a bulwark against American isolationism, meaning the continent won't be left defenseless if some future president yanks the US out of NATO. Yet, for all it may be a nice dream, is European autonomy any more than that? Any more than just a wistful fantasy as unlikely as you winning the lottery or me regrowing my hair? Depending on who you ask, the answer ranges anywhere from, with hard work, strategic autonomy could be possible, to those deadbeats, please, get real. As the war in Ukraine has shown, the old continent is still hopelessly dependent on Washington for its military muscle. However, there are some signs that things could be changing, that Europe may finally be ready to step up and take care of its own defense. Whether these small signs are enough will be what we're focusing on today. In another place, in another time, it could have been the beginning of a European transformation. When Russia launched its unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, many in the defense community wondered if it wasn't the wake-up call that Europe needed, the catalyst for a strategic revolution that would at last see Brussels translate its economic might into hard power. For years beforehand, European leaders have been talking about strategic autonomy. In 2017, Angela Merkel told a campaign crowd that, quote, "The times when we could completely rely on others are, to an extent, over." The year before, the EU Global Strategy document had discussed the topic at length. As then President Donald Trump kept threatening to pull the US out of NATO, Emmanuel Macron practically made strategic autonomy his catchphrase. So yeah, It's easy to imagine a world in which the invasion of Ukraine finally jolted the continent into action, finally turned rhetoric into reality. Sadly, though, that isn't the world that we live in. In our world, it wasn't Brussels that led the way assisting Ukraine, but Washington. American military aid for Kiev far outstrips that of the EU and the UK combined. Where Europe did provide Ukrainians support, it was initially done piecemeal, a result of politicians in individual capitals like London or Warsaw stepping up rather than a coordinated effort. The same thing happened with defense. While some nations, notably Poland, are today spending insane amounts to boost their military prowess, it's notably not a joint project. If anything, many European nations now feel more reliant on America than ever. Speaking to the New York Times, director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, Guntram Wolf, described how the EU's goal has always been to have Germany provide the economic muscle and France the military prowess. But, he told the Times, the Ukraine war was a big game changer for European security, and Central and Eastern Europeans immediately understood that they need the US for their security, and Germany quickly decided the same. In many ways, it was a default return to the comforting logic of the Cold War, to an era in which Uncle Sam's #1 security priority was ensuring the USSR stayed out of Western Europe. The only problem is, this isn't the Cold War anymore. Priorities have changed for both America and for Europe. On the American side, the #1 strategic challenge in 2023 is not Moscow, it's Beijing, an adversary far closer in might to America than the USSR ever was. As Breaking Defense summed up, quote, "The demands of ensuring European security and Indo-Pacific deterrence will strain America's defense and military capacity. Avoiding strategic overreach should be a core priority for Washington." Or, as former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development, which is a hell of a mouthful, Elbridge Colby bluntly put it on Twitter, "If we have to leave Europe more exposed, so be it. I'd much rather not, but Asia is more important than Europe." Of course, it's not only America's priorities that have changed since the fall of the Berlin Wall. There are good reasons why the current dynamic is unhealthy for Europe too. The main one is that European leaders can read what guys like Elbridge Colby are saying, and they are terrified. Emmanuel Macron recently declared, "Will the American administration always be the same? Nobody can tell, and we cannot delegate our collective security and our stability to the choices of American voters." At the same time, parts of Europe's security establishment are worried about what will happen if Brussels does stay wedded to Washington, namely that Europeans will be pulled into a conflict with China. To be clear, large parts of Europe, especially in the East, are sympathetic to Washington's position on Beijing. But that's not always the case in the continent's west. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz attracted criticism last November for travelling to China to drum up investment. This April, Macron was pilloried for seeming to suggest that strategic autonomy for Europe might mean staying neutral in case of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Still, perhaps the most pertinent question isn't what European autonomy would mean, but why this is even a question in the first place. To quote a recent article in War on the Rocks, "These are wealthy, advanced nations with acknowledged security problems and a growing awareness that continuing to rely on the United States entails long-term risks. So why do they remain so incapable of formulating their own response to crises in their neighborhood?" End quote. It's this fundamental question that we'll be attempting to answer in the video today. So, one of the striking things about the drive for European autonomy is just how damn long it's been going on for. As far back as 1998, the British and French governments were heralding the Saint-Malo Declaration as the dawn of a new era for the continent, one in which the EU would have, to quote, "the capacity for autonomous decision-making and action backed up by credible military forces," end quote. Yet, even as the American troop presence dwindled from a Cold War high of hundreds of thousands to a mere 60,000 in 2013, that new era just never seemed to arrive. Instead, Europe seemed to become ever more dependent on the USA. Partially, the issues have been financial. While pre-financial crisis Europe had an economy roughly the same size as America's, it now has one roughly a third smaller. And that's only if you include the UK. Look solely at the EU, and its economy is barely half the size of the United States. That means that America has naturally become more dominant in the relationship. It's also been able to spend far more on its military.
Jeremy Shapiro and Jana Buglerian of the European Council on Foreign Relations write that, quote, between 2008 and 2021, US military expenditure increased from $656 billion to $801 billion, end quote. The figure for the EU and the UK combined, by contrast, rose from $303 billion to a rather paltry $325 billion. Clearly then, money is part of the problem. But it's not the only problem. After all, while Europe's economy may pale beside those of America and China, it is still the third largest in the world. Add in non-EU member Britain, which collaborates with countries like France and Italy on defense, and there should be enough money sloshing around to fund a strong military policy. And it's here that we get to what may be the real core problem with European defense. Rather than one military investing in and procuring standardized parts, you have 28 different ones all working wildly out of sync with one another. Back in 2017, a review highlighted that Europe's forces were operating 178 different types of weapon systems compared to just 30 for the USA. While having more platforms might sound kinda cool, in reality, it is a disaster, one in which the key phrases in our word cloud would be stuff like duplication, wastage, and lack of interoperability. Speaking to Politico, former French Europe Minister Nathaniel Lusseau lamented that, quote, our efforts are fragmented. There is so much wastage because we have so many different models of tanks, vessels, and fighter jets, end quote. In many ways, this is just a fresh twist on the core problem the EU has wrestled with over the last decade. Is the continent a single, unified entity like the United States, or is it a collection of individual nations loosely tied together in an economic union? In military procurement, at least, it's currently the latter. For years, France, Germany, Spain have all been working together to get their future combat air system off the ground, but disagreements between Paris and Berlin have dragged the entire project into a quagmire, one it likely won't emerge from before 2040. Or how about this example highlighted by The Economist? France shuns the German-led Sky Shield project to develop air defenses because it relies on non-European suppliers. German officials report that France treats strategic autonomy as a way to use German money to support French firms. This lack of collaboration damages Europe far more than any loss of spending power. When confronted with a limited budget, most militaries would opt for streamlining. Europe, by contrast, opts for waste and duplication. Per Jeremy Shapiro and Jana Buglerian's paper, only 18% of European procurement budgets are spent in cooperation with one another. As our comically inept former PM Liz Truss might say,
that is a disgrace.
Luckily, it's a disgrace that European leaders are increasingly aware of. At the Vilnius NATO summit this year, for example, the official communique specifically highlighted the need for greater defense industrial cooperation within Europe. Some nations are already doing this, giving the wider continent a possible roadmap. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland recently signed a joint declaration of intent to create a unified Nordic Air Force, a declaration that should help streamline all four nations' procurement processes. Yet it's not wastage alone that has made Europe such a hot mess in defense, or even into EU rivalries. Rather, it may come down to a single, rather depressing issue: a lack of any unified vision about what Europe really wants to do. Given that Europe currently has a genocidal autocrat fighting a brutal war on its borders, you might think that the continent's leaders would be pretty damn unified in their strategic thinking. But that is not the impression that they're giving. While countries near or bordering Russia and Belarus have become extremely hawkish, some of their Western neighbors act like they still want to go back to signing cheap gas deals over fine wines in Moscow. In particular, Emmanuel Macron has outraged leaders in places like Poland and the Baltics by saying things about Putin needing an off-ramp, or how Moscow deserves security guarantees. Olaf Scholz likewise infuriated not just the eastern countries, but also Britain by dithering over whether to send Ukraine Leopard 2 tanks last winter, a dithering which helped give Russian forces time to dig in and construct robust offensive lines. To be fair, both of these leaders, they seem to be changing their tune. France now officially supports Ukraine joining NATO. Germany might finally be getting its act together with rearming. Still, the damage has already been done. In places like Warsaw, Tallinn, Vilnius, and Riga, there is real anger that Paris and Berlin didn't listen to them on the issue of Russia. And that makes European strategic autonomy harder to implement than ever. As long as Uncle Sam is around, Poland and others feel like someone's got their back, rely solely on Brussels. And there's a sneaking suspicion that the French and Germans might greet further Russian land grabs with the resigned c'est la vie. Or, as War on the Rocks put it, always skeptical about the idea of strategic autonomy, they, the eastern states, now think this would amount to strategic suicide. This chasm of distrust between East and West means it's impossible to have real European leadership in a crisis, but it also means Europeans remain divided on their most pressing foreign policy goals. To illustrate what this would feel like for an American audience, let's put Russia aside for a moment and focus a bit on China. In Washington, there's broad, bipartisan consensus that Beijing is a strategic adversary. Even if some lawmakers are more hawkish than others, the terms of the debate have been set. Were war to break out over Taiwan, it's pretty clear that Democrats and Republicans alike would back Taipei. Well, now imagine that instead of consensus, you had a whole bunch of states returning lawmakers who would respond to a Taiwan war by talking about providing Xi Jinping with off-ramps, who, prior to the war, had become dangerously hooked on Chinese investments, who had even, as Italy's current deputy PM did with Vladimir Putin, worn t-shirts bearing Xi Jinping's Winnie the Pooh-like face, or, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, seemed to be rooting for Beijing to win its war of conquest. Obviously, the analogy's not perfect. China is across the Pacific, rather than on America's doorstep, and no US states were occupied by Beijing for most of the 20th century. Still, it hopefully illustrates why many Eastern European countries don't trust the West to do the right thing in a crisis. The knock-on effect of this distrust is that Europe cannot formulate a common foreign policy. Without Washington to paper over the cracks and provide reassurance, things would likely be even more dysfunctional than they are now. Now, as hopeless as this all might sound, we don't want to just give one side of the argument here. As we mentioned back in the introduction of today's video, there are some small signs that Europe might be able to increase its autonomy. Maybe not enough for Uncle Sam to ever seriously quit NATO, but perhaps enough that he can at least start turning his focus to the Indo-Pacific without worrying too much. Signs that Europe may one day be capable of translating its economic power into military might. Although some of the discourse around strategic autonomy, including, obviously, this video, focuses on defense, going it alone militarily isn't Europe's only goal. Far less remarked upon has been the economic aspect of autonomy, an aspect that includes both Europe's successful transition off Russian gas, as well as an ongoing attempt to distance itself from China. According to The Economist, quote, "As for the economic dimension of autonomy, the EU has made marked progress," end quote. That's because, after decades of hesitation, the bloc is finally starting to pool economic policymaking, not just building on the massive issuance of common debt seen during the pandemic, but utilizing a host of instruments to reduce exposure to China and implementing new subsidies to speed up the green transition. And this is important because it's yet another sign that Europe is capable of moving quickly and making dramatic decisions when it wants to. Just look at the Russian gas cut-off the bloc endured last winter. It was painful, sure, but also supercharged by an insane building spree, the sort Yimbys have wet dreams about. In Germany, for example, the build time for liquefied natural gas terminals was reduced from 3 years to just 10 months. When it's forced to act, in other words, Europe doesn't just fart around with its thumb up its bottom. The hope is that this sort of energy and money could be harnessed into the military sphere. If it does happen, that will be extremely bad news for Russia, because even without the UK, the EU's economy absolutely dwarfs Moscow's. Putin is overseeing a GDP 7 times smaller than that of the EU. Start spending that money wisely, and you should get a Europe strong enough to permanently deter Russian imperialism. Luckily, spending that money wisely is something that Europe, both via the EU and via NATO, has recently pledged to do. Published the month after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Strategic Compass is an ongoing attempt to reorganize Europe's various defense industries into something more coherent. Over a timeframe of 5 to 10 years, it envisages investment in new capabilities and technologies, increased interoperability among militaries, and a marked increase in joint deployments. Admittedly, when the document first landed in March of 2022, it was something of a dud. The European Council on Foreign Relations declared it brand new and already obsolete, noting, quote, "The Strategic Compass underlines the collective action problem at the heart of European attempts to pool defense efforts and resources. Everyone agrees that closer integration is essential, but everyone wants someone else to go first," end quote. Still, its core points have since come to be reflected in NATO communiques and national strategy documents. And there's a growing awareness that defense production and procurement needs to be better coordinated. And it's here that we get to the potential ace up Europe's sleeve, the continent's world-class industrial base. Rheinmetall, Thal Safran, Leonardo, Saab, BAE Systems, MBDA, the list of top-tier weapons manufacturers in Europe is enormous. The know-how and ability to build missiles, warships, tanks, fighter jets, and a lot more is deeply rooted in the continent. Now, so far, many of these makers have been unable to scale up production even as the Ukraine war grinds on, a side effect of governments refusing to guarantee purchases of kits if the war ends before delivery. The point, however, is that the ability to do so is there. It's just a lack of political willpower that stops Europe from deploying all of its massive advantages. Of course, even if every leader on the continent suddenly saw the light tomorrow, Europe still wouldn't be able to completely divorce itself from the USA. As The Economist notes, there are some vital capacities that Europeans simply do not have in sufficient numbers, like heavy lift or air transport and refueling, or ISR, as intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance. But in a way, this might not really matter. Very, very few Europeans advocating for a Europe that's militarily on par with the United States. Likewise, very few Americans want to cut Europe off to the point of just sitting back and doing nothing if Putin invaded Poland. What reasonable folk do want to see is a Europe that's strong enough to make Russia too scared to try anything, to make sure the Kremlin knows it will face immediate and total defeat if Putin tries to move his borders even an inch west. Given Europe dominates Russia in terms of population, wealth, industry, and almost every other conceivable metric, this should be eminently doable. Not quite the full strategic autonomy Macron dreams of, but a gigantic step in the right direction. Not that a massive arms build-up will happen just on its own. Now it's time for our final chapter today, the chapter where we look at the different ways Europe might finally be able to become an independent actor. So, a little bit earlier in the video, we mentioned the plan to create a combined Nordic Air Force. Well, what works in Europe's north might work in other regions too. At least, that's what a paper from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, recently proposed as a way of solving Europe's defence problems. The basic idea goes something like this. Although there might be too much mistrust between European states as a whole, that doesn't hold true at a smaller level. Across the EU and the wider continent, there are clusters of countries with shared outlooks and histories that very much do trust one another. That might be the Nordic countries, or the Benelux countries of Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. It might be the Baltic states, or France and Germany, or the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The point is that several of these clusters exist. So, the CIS's argument goes, rather than try and integrate the entirety of European defence, why not just integrate those clusters? By working in small groups, European militaries can cut away a lot of wastage. Not as much as a completely unified continent could, but far, far more than is the case today. As CSIS notes, collective action problems are less prevalent in small groups where free riders cannot hide, members are more inclined to trust each other, identification and enforcement are easier, and group identity or solidarity may be stronger. With that trust in place, members within each small group could divide up labour and specialisation, playing to each nation's strengths. The result would be a Europe that no longer fields 178 weapons platforms and dozens of different armies,